Well, let's go back to the days of jolly old England. Um, and the War of the Roses. And I think that I indicated that this was essentially the inspiration for the TV series Game of Thrones, except for the fact that I think Game of Thrones is probably less complicated than this one was. Um, the the issue here was the question of who succeeds Edward III. Edward III ruled from 1327 to 1377, and he had lots of sons. Well, that's not unusual, but they survived to adulthood. And so the question is which son has the right to the throne? Well, it went to, at first it went to Edward the Black Prince, but he had died before his father had, so it actually went to Edward III's grandson, Richard II. Now, Richard II was so vicious and so incompetent that he was persuaded to resign as king sometime in 1399, and sometime in 1400, probably in February, either he starved to death or somebody held a pillow over his face, which kind of is how you get rid of old useless kings. Kind of a jolly time. Anyway, if you take a look at the family tree here, Edward III, of course, and you can just see the number of sons he had, all of whom, of course, think they deserve the throne. You can see Richard II there on the left-hand side, and of course his execution. Then you notice that the second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, you have to go way down to find a descendant of his who becomes king, for whatever reason. The third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, you notice he has by his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, three kings: Henry IV, his son, Henry V, John of Gaunt's grandson, Henry VI, John of Gaunt's great-grandson. And then you go down and you notice, by the way, that John of Gaunt later on marries Catherine Swineford. Now that's interesting because they had a thatch of illegitimate children before they got married. And then through the miracles of church governance, somehow none of those children became legitimate. Isn't that amazing? And then the next son down, of course, is Edmund, Duke of Yorkton, and again, Duke of York is an active claimant to the throne. Thomas Gloucester, Duke of Gloucester, further down, is going to be, his family is going to be a player in this, but they are not, strictly speaking, going to have kingly offspring, or queenly offspring for that matter. So Richard II gets executed. Well, I don't think anybody's going to complain about that. And one of John of Gaunt's heirs, Henry IV, is the one who overthrows him. Notice they were cousins, untidy family. Henry IV, and then, of course, Henry V becomes king. Henry V, by the way, is a rather remarkable figure. And then Henry VI, who unfortunately had a number of problems, physical and mental, and that's really going to unspring things, because John of Gaunt is the head or the father of the House of Lancaster, and when in this atmosphere with so many people having a claim to the throne, the fact that Henry VI was not really up to governance, and in fact has a breakdown of some type around 1453, this is unpleasant, and is just inviting trouble, which arrived pretty quickly. So why, that's John of Gaunt, and that's Lionel of Clarence. And of course, in the long run, Lionel of Clarence, who is not an active seeker of the throne, at least not at that moment, his family is going to be descended, his claim to the throne, or his family's claim to the throne, is going to descend through the female line, which is unusual. But because he's the second son, that is, he's one son before John of Gaunt, his descendants way down are going to go back and say, hey, our great, great, great was before your great, great, great. And so as a result, people are going to seek to be descended from Lionel of Clarence, even if it is through the female line. But anyway, so we have three kings here descended from John of Gaunt. And, you know, what can I tell you? Henry IV was a competent king. Henry V was a very competent king, and Henry VI, unfortunately, as I've said, had a number of physical and mental issues. I'm not 100% certain that in today's world that he would have succeeded to the throne. There was a problem. If you remember, Henry V is a very, very competent king, and Henry V conquers Paris and becomes both King of England and King of France, marries the daughter of the King of France, Charles VI. The only trouble is Charles VI, for good reasons, is known as Charles the Mad. And that may have been what may have been an inheritance issue there, DNA issue there, which that might have been why Henry VI ends up being less than competent and indeed has a breakdown in the 1450s. Can't say, but it certainly looks that way. Well, there were two battles of St. Albans. Both times between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. And each time the family that was in power ends up out of power. And then something interesting happens. And each time you swap from the Lancaster line to the York line, or the York line to the Lancaster line, you end up with something like this, a so-called Parliament of the Devils. And this is a chance for the one side to get back at the other. Well, you know, you've got princes and dukes and all that on both sides. And so, you know, you can't have them, you know, rustling around the kingdom. After all, that's untidy, and it gets in the way of whoever is governing. And they passed what are called the Bills of Attainder. Now, what's an attainder? An attainder is a decision by a parliamentary body that you're guilty. Oh, we'll figure out what you're guilty of later on, but you're guilty. And so the different parliaments that would come in when they would switch from one line to the other would promptly go after the other line. And not in every instance, but in most instances, if you were what were called attainted, you got a trip to the gallows, or perhaps you were shortened by a head. And not in every instance, but in most. The U.S. Constitutional Convention in the United States in 1787 went way out of its way to say, no bills of attainder, not by the United States government, not by states, not by anything. And so it's a vicious way to rule by declaring people guilty and then figuring out what they were guilty of. That's going to stay in English law for quite some time. And of course, in something like the Parliament of 1461, 1462, when the Yorkists get into power, you know, the sole reason for that Parliament to meet was to attaint their enemies. They make a number of decisions. And one of the key things here is that Edward IV, who is the king, Yorkist king, who happens to take over at this moment, Edward IV, turns to Parliament and says, you have the power to do this. So it's not technically the king who's ordering these executions and attainders and what have you. It's Parliament. And that's a recognition of the I hate to say this because old-time historians wouldn't say this, but of the growing power of Parliament. Now, it's still a body that is primarily judicial. An attainder is a judicial act, in a manner of speaking, but it's getting steady. You're coming to depend more and more on Parliament, which represents the whole realm. It's not just a little council of dukes and the king's buddies and stuff like that. That's signing off on the king's plan. Instead, it's the whole realm, and the kings were happy to have Parliament do things like that. Save them the trouble, Well, Edward IV dies, and he has 2 kids. In the middle of this chaos, and by the way, Parliament is doing okay in the middle of this chaos because they're like the stable thing. And Edward IV had 2 kids, and they were mid-teens and younger, and he had a brother, Richard III. Now, we don't actually know this for sure, but the odds are pretty good that Richard III offed his nephews, one of whom would have been the legitimate king, would have been Edward V, but that's not what happened. Richard III probably, again, can't be 100% certain, but Richard III probably, had his kids killed, had his nephews killed in the Tower of London. What can I say? It's a rough, ruthless time, and family was everything. Even if you happen to have to bump off a couple of your family members to make sure that family was everything. And Richard III was a fairly busy guy, and of course, the princes in the Tower, very dramatic little thing here, and we know for a while they were fed because we have the bills. We have records of them being fed, and at some point in there, the feeding cuts out. So whether they were killed, starved to death, or something else happened, who knows? People did die in those days of plague and things like that. So this could have been just fortuitous, could have been lucky. From the point of view of Richard III. Well, let's try to run through this again. Okay, so you have here the Duke of York, who gives whose line extends down to Edward IV of York, and then Edward V, who knows. And then the line of John the Gaunt. And by the way, you notice that they're not in proper chronological order. And then John of Gaunt, of course, goes, gives birth to the Lancaster line, which goes through the 3 kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. So there's some tie that, you can certainly trace the lines down. And of course, on the side here, you can see on the left-hand side, you can see Lionel, Duke of Clarence. And remember, his key role is that he's the number 2 son. And therefore, he can be tied under the laws of that time. His line could be considered to have priority over both Edmund, Duke of York, and John of Gaunt. Could. But remember, John of Gaunt had a flock of illegitimate children with Catherine Swineford, and Catherine Swineford, her descendants, let's say one of them marries a queen, And by the way, he gets executed after she dies. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time at the wrong battle, and they execute him. And of course, his offspring marries into the Beaufort family, which is, of course, a very wealthy family. Margaret Beaufort herself is quite wealthy, and she's going to spend her time scheming to put her son, who doesn't have a really great claim to this throne, on the throne. And so we have two lines, both of whom have at least reasonable heirs. We have a third line descending through the female line, who certainly is an important line in trying to figure out who the rightful king is. And then, of course, you have this kind of illegitimate line stretching down from Catherine Swineford, from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swineford, which has made some interesting and good marriages, also made some mistakes. But Margaret Beaufort was not to be fooled with. She, by the way, marries Edmund Tudor. She's 12 years of age, and she gets pregnant. And she will have Henry, Henry Tudor, who will become Henry VII. She's 13 years old when she gives birth, and there's reason to believe that she wasn't fully developed physically, and there's reason to believe that Henry's birth so injured her that she could not have other children. She had Edmund Tudor doesn't last very long. But there's reason to believe that, and she loved her next husband very much, apparently. Although she will be buried with Edmund because he was, after all, the father of her son. But there's reason to believe that the Tudor line only had one heir, and it had to do with getting pregnant at the age of 12. Well, Richard III, known across the kingdom for being a little too clever, a little too vicious. That kind of thing ends up with dead kings as a rule. Henry Tudor goes to France, recruits an army, and will eventually come over to England and land with an army. And he lands to the north, which suggests that he knew that the princes in the Tower were dead, because if he had landed in the north, way above London, defeated Richard III, and those princes were still alive, he would have just made them king, or made the eldest king. So, so pretty good chance that Henry Tudor knew that the princes were dead. You could suspect that they may have ended up dead thanks to him. I don't know. There's all kinds of rumors about these things. And again, if you're taking notes, this is, you're on your third page at this point. So Owen Tudor marries the ex-queen of France, Catherine of Valois. Pretty good marriage. Marrying a queen is not such a bad deal. Then, of course, here's Edmund Tudor. Dies young, dies short, not that terribly long after marrying Margaret. And of course, Margaret then in a somewhat later age. And then we get the Battle of Bosworth Field, which is where Henry Tudor and Richard III lock horns. Immortalized by Shakespeare, where Richard III runs off, is trying to run away, and he yells, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Didn't say that. But it makes for good theater. For a long time, we thought Richard III's body was gone. We thought it had been thrown into a river, actually. But recently, we found it under a parking lot, of all things. A car park, as they say in England. And the body pretty much fits the description of Richard III. So for whatever reason, the body seems to have been preserved. But Henry VII won. And it's an interesting thing about defeating a king and killing him. You get to be king. And that's how we end up with Henry VII, Tudor. Okay, so all those odd things that happen in the Tudor line, the illegitimacies and all that stuff, they end up with one of the most powerful kings in English history. A number of people whom Henry Tudor had executed, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000, which is a staggering number in England at that time. He didn't execute his enemies that much, but in the chaos that had surrounded the War of the Roses, there have been, all kinds of highwaymen and thugs and thieves and what have you. Oh, they end up dead. And you know what? The people of England, okay, because Henry Tudor brought order, law and order back. He was a ruthless thug. He was also a bit of a gambler. And Henry Tudor brought law and order back. And for many years, for really hundreds of years, if you read about Henry Tudor, you would have read that he just kind of ruled as a dictator, and that's not completely true. He ruled with his iron fist, and people who in England had been fighting since 1377 to figure out who the king was. So the king, the figure, the kingship is going up, 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 and it's kind of breaking free of Parliament at this point, but not completely. Henry VII saw Parliament as a useful way to govern, and so he didn't just say, yeah, go away, Parliament. Instead, what we find is that he held parliaments for the very strange reason of doing England's business. It was guided by him, and Henry VII did all kinds of wicked things to control his enemies. Trials could be interesting in those days because first you get the decision, then you get the trial. But having said that, Henry VII did bring law and order back to England, and he may not have been a pleasant fellow. I don't think he was, but he made one other good decision. Henry VII is descended from John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was the head of the Lancaster family. Henry VII marries the female heir of the York family, combining the two roses and bringing the War of the Roses to the end. I realize this has been a long trek through English history, but nevertheless, here we are. Strong king, strong parliament. Thing that the civil wars are over. Things are about to take a very different turn because of a fellow by the name of Martin Luther, who is about to upset the wagon of Europe with his views. Everybody out there, take care. And we'll see you, if you're still listening, we'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.